Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Richard Dwayne Willing. Now, he is an author of two fantastic books you can pick up on his website, rdwaynewilling.com. The first one, Money, the 12th and Final Religion. The next one is The American Caliphate. Now, these are two very thought-provoking books, and if you're ready to have some paradigms altered, I would recommend reading these. So just an enormous amount of information and pretty easy to read as well. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us tonight here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Fine, excellent. Looking forward.
Absolutely. It's great to have you on the show. We've had several requests to get you on here, and I was hoping we could really discuss both of these books in pretty good detail with the time that we have together. But first, I'd like to get into who you are as a person. If you could give our audience a brief description about yourself and what brought you down the path to write these types of books.
Well, I was motivated by a political disaster that I was witness to, the so-called Watergate saga of President Nixon. I had a function at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board at the time. Nixon was going to convert all the savings and loans into commercial banks. Now, that's a revolutionary move for anybody familiar with banking, because the savings and loans are just loan institutions and savings. They could not create money, where a regular bank creates money. And Nixon was going to sideswipe the Federal Reserve by creating a parallel system. And my job was to go out and make sure all the savings and loans were on the same protocol so we could put them on a computer, a central computer across from the White House. And this was all underway and moving along. And if I'd been successful, in that enterprise, we would have a parallel banking system now. The Federal Reserve may be would have been under serious competition. But
what would that have done, though? I mean, would that have caused more of a fruitful economy?
I think so, because your savings and loans were centered in small-town America, and the local doctor and farm implement and big farmers and car dealers and your druggists and your construction guys were all members of the savings and loan on the board. So it was a very local economic interest. So had they been able to be commercial banks where they could control their fortune directly instead of having to go through the Federal Reserve System, I think it would have been better for the economy in general, and you would never have had that interest rate crisis of the Carter period, because there's no need for that. But the purpose of those high interest rates during Carter was to destroy the savings and loans. Very clever process. Wall Street's just too smart for us. That's all there is to it. They wanted to get the money out of the savings and loans, away from local people. So they created money market funds. And you could get a money market fund by a certificate of deposit. And the reason you do that was because it paid a higher interest rate. And by one more point of interest, people were taking their money out of the savings and loan and putting it in the money market fund certificate of deposit. And so Wall Street bled the money out of the savings and loans, and then the savings loans were desperate for money because people wanted mortgages and they had obligations and so forth. So what happened was Wall Street comes back to the savings and loans with the same money that they've taken out. They come back with what they call jumbo deposits, whereas they would bring a $100,000 deposit to the savings loan and get a certificate of deposit. And they would pay 5 or 6%, which was a pretty good rate back in that time. And so the savings and loan was just glad to have the money, so they paid the extra interest to get their own money back. Very clever. And the upshot of it was that they kept escalating the interest rates and pumping the money out of the savings and loans until finally the savings loans, the real estate business, the real estate industry just dried up because mortgages were too expensive. So the savings and loans couldn't meet their obligations and they were bankrupted. Very clever process. And the trick of it was, with a certificate of deposit, it was a federal guaranteed document. So Wall Street could take that document for a $100,000 deposit and trade it on the commercial markets. And this is all kind of convoluted, but that's the way Wall Street rips off your money, and they did it again, a version of it, with the mortgage swindle.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so the same protocol works every time. But anyway, while I was at the bank board, Federal Home Loan Bank Board, I had the assignment to make sure the savings and loans could become banks. And I went about my task, and some months after I'd gotten the assignment, I was called into the office, and they said, we're going to do some changes around here. And I said, well, what about our project? And they said, what project? And they denied that they'd ever had that project underway in the first place, of converting the S&Ls. And I thought, wow, this is really exciting. I'm in the twilight zone here. But I knew something at very high levels was going on, because a lot of whispering and a lot of transfers and a lot of shuffling around at the head office personnel. And one thing led to another, and it became obvious that Nixon was under tremendous pressure. And so he canceled his project, of course. And one thing led to another, and they finally got rid of him. But the key player, was a guy named Preston Martin. Now, he'd been the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which was the savings and loan head office. And apparently, he decided that he'd rather have a position at the Federal Reserve than be head of the savings and loan conversion. So it looks like he double-crossed Nixon. And I'm offering him up as the classic deep throat, which supposedly talked to those two reporters in the Washington Post, because they were supposed to be meeting people in garages and alleys and all that. But I'm sure they were sitting with Preston Martin in the best restaurants in Washington, getting debriefed on how the system was coming down. And so I don't have a lot of faith in the Washington Post. But the upshot of it is, of course, that Nixon got resigned. He was purged, actually. And my task of converting the S&Ls went up in smoke, and I saw the power of money dismantle the presidency. And I thought, wow, that's really impressive, because I always thought the president was numero uno. Little did I know that he's a pretty low on the totem pole. And so one thing led to another, and I left Washington and migrated to Canada. But
if I can jump in real quick, you don't hear a lot about Nixon except for Watergate. That's typically the overall archetype of, if somebody thinks of Nixon, first thing, oh, it's Watergate. You don't hear much about this. And I often wonder who actually owns the Federal Reserve anyway, because isn't the Federal Reserve compiled by a bunch of offshore interests, basically?
That's the legend, but theoretically it's owned by its member banks. The Federal Reserve was set up as, if you were a major bank in the United States at that time, prior to the Fed, you could issue your own money, your own currency. National Bank had their money, Chase had their money, and the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, could issue Treasury bills, Treasury notes. So everybody had a kind of a piece of the pie. But when the Federal Reserve was instituted, all these bankers got together and said, we'll gang up on the economy. And the way they did it was becoming so-called owners of the Federal Reserve. So they formed into 12 regions in the U.S., and each of the regions owned so much of the Federal Reserve. So it's technically nationally owned, but owned by national interests. But the Chase and the National and manufacturers and all those great banks, Wells Fargo, they have huge stockholders from foreign interests. I mean, you could be a lot of British, a lot of Swiss banks owned stock in American banks. So through that process, they have influence in the Federal Reserve System. But they're not, the Federal Reserve is theoretically owned by the federal banks in the United States.
And I find it interesting, you brought up the British and the Swiss, but how much do the Chinese and the Saudi Arabians and maybe even the Russians have invested in many of these banks and corporations that are heavily vested into the banks as well?
At that time, it was mainly British.
So mainly British. And were you able to find out how far up the totem pole that went?
Bank of England is the mother lode of central banking. And Bank of England, of course, has been financing the American dream for 200 years. And there were a lot of Germans involved too, but that was primarily because of a tension that was going on in Europe. World War I was just at the same time as the Fed was being invented. World War I began when the Germans and the British were competing for world markets, 1914, 12, 13, that time. And the Germans were winning. And finally, the Germans had a lot of money. So they made the terminal mistake of going to London, which is the center of world finance, had been for 200 years. And they went to London, the Germans went to London and began lending money less than the British were lending money. Well, the Brits would not have that. But Germany had a vision of Berlin becoming a world center, a world financial center. So they were taking head-to-head, they were going head-to-head with the British about world finance power. And of course, that's World War I. That just wasn't going to happen. So had the Germans been more cautious and a little more discreet, they might have avoided World War I. But they were caught up in their own egoism. And of course, they were very successful as manufacturers and engineers and so forth, and becoming well known worldwide. And so they challenged the British on their own turf and lost. So that was a lesson to be learned. Not wise to challenge the British on their own terms. And
let me ask you this, if I can jump in for a second. Is it true about the family names like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds? Are the Rothschilds really the biggest names in the banking industries from the research that you've done?
Oh, they were the Red Shield crowd come from Germany, and the old man had 4 sons, 4 I think, and he was a pawnbroker or something, if not, just a small-time guy. But he knew about how to do finance. And one thing led to another, and he taught his 4 sons how to do finance. And at this time, it's moving simultaneously with telegraph, telephone, steamships. Communications were really becoming worldwide. And he caught the drift of it. And his 4 sons were each designated one market to do banking in. And now, the Jewish ghetto in Europe has a deep history of lending money. And the classic story of the ghetto is the Knights Templar. This goes back, 1100, way back. So the Knights went off on a crusade, or the Crusaders did, and through time they invented this concept of knights, and they learned how to do finance, because prior to the Crusades, the typical European had no idea how finance worked. The Jewish ghetto knew how the finance worked for several reasons. But anyway, so if anybody wanted any real money, they had to go to the ghetto and borrow from a Jewish lender. Well, one thing led to another. The Crusaders discovered, thanks to the Arabs, they learned algebra and science and finance. So 2 of the Crusaders got on one horse and went to the Vatican, to the Pope, and said, "We know how this finance works." And they explained it to the Pope, and he said, "Whoa, that's great! Now we know we don't need the ghetto lenders anymore. We'll do our own finance." Well, and he called them the Knights Templar. He said, "You guys are going to be the Knights Templar. You're going to look after all the finance of the church." So these two con artists, the first thing they did, they went to the ghetto, and the ghetto loan rate was 43%. Well, they went back to the Pope and made money available at 65%. So the Knights Templar, the great mystery of Knights Templar is they were borrowing from the Jewish ghetto at 45%, lending it to the Pope at 65%, making a 50% markup, and had no risk. So the ghetto thought, that's a good deal. You know, we got
That's a pretty genius plan there, huh?
Oh, it's clever. It's really brilliant. Yeah, but it's lost in the literature. And but the upshot of it is that Philip le Bel and one of the popes got wind of this thing and said, "This is there's a swindle going on here," and they closed down the Knights Templar, seized all the records, burned all the records, and that's the end of the Knights Templar. But in the meantime, something else surfaces called the Inquisition. Now, what they discovered that the Talmud has chapter and verse and paragraph about how to do finance. And if you're a young Jewish kid in a synagogue seminary at that time, age 14 or so, you spent with your twin. They put two boys together, and they memorized every combination of financial enterprise you can do, and that went on for several years. So by the time these kids graduated, they were totally familiar with finance. And the church had figured out, and some of the monarchs had figured out, wow, there's a secret in here, there's a secret in the Talmud. So then they put on the Inquisition to round up to sack the synagogues, because they wanted that information. And of course that comes across in history as the Inquisition of non-believers. But what the church was after, and what the monarchs were after, the ones that could read and write, was the secrets in the Talmud of how to do business, money business. Well, in the meantime, there's a great exodus. They're expelling the Jews from every way you can think of. And a lot of them just went to London. They said it's too dangerous, because they'd lost whatever the Templars owed them. They lost because the records were destroyed. So the Jews some of them made their way to London. And it was quite common at that time for a Jewish lender to say, take the money, just take the money, pay me interest, forget about the principal. Pay me interest for the rest of your life. So this was the beginning of London as a financial center, and it was improved greatly by the Huguenots, because also taking place at the same time in Europe was the Cathars and the Huguenots, and they were very competent financially. And the church got upset with them and finally expelled them, and the Huguenots, a number of them wound up in London. So you have the Jewish financial experience, the Huguenot experience, and then a derivative of the Cathars. So you got every known genius of finance is now in London. And so now we have the beginning of the first bank, the first central bank, which is the Bank of England, which the founders of the Bank of England were basically Huguenots. And so that begins, and it's a very clever process about how they...
Can I jump in real quick? What do you mean by Huguenots? I've never heard that term before.
Oh, it was a culture within France. It was let's say it was, what would you call it? An ethnic group within France. And the Cathars were might have been a regional group, might have been like Texans or Californians or something. Like we would speak to them because of their geographical reference. I suspect that's what it means. That's an area of France they were from. Okay. And so anyway, they created the Bank of England, and let me see now. That goes on that gives them a head start, and takes us to the American Revolution. And the American founding fathers were self-made, well-educated, good families, really wealthy, very competent. And they started their own money system, but it didn't have any debt. It didn't have any interest. So the Crown, the British Crown, found out about this, Parliament, and they said, okay, you guys can print your own money, but you have to put a 6% tax on all the money you print. And of course, the colonists said, no, that's not a deal. We're not going to do that. And in the famous Tea Party, which is another false proposition, the objection was that the Parliament of England had refused to negotiate with the colonists about this tax on the printed money. And so the Parliament just lost a chance to make a really good deal. But anyway, the upshot of it is, of course, is the rebellion and the separation of the colony. and the 13 colonies sort of coalesced. But during the Revolutionary War, they had their own currency. They had a national currency called the Continental. But it had nothing, there was no substance. It was just, that's how we did things back then. We needed the money, we printed it. We fought the war. But during the war, the British caught on to this, and what they had printing plants in England making copies of the American money, counterfeiting it. And they would send a shipload of this counterfeit money to the colonies, and then one of the generals, the British general, put a notice out and said, between 10 and 2 every day, you can come and pick up all the continental currency you want for the price of the paper. And so they were counterfeiting, trying to break the American economy with counterfeit currency. Anyway, after the rebellion was over and the Americans got their independence, so to speak, the continental currency was just went to zero value. But it's the beginning of our Congress at its best. The first big swindle was Alexander Hamilton. When all these colonists are holding this continental paper as money, they're treating it as money, but its value is going way down. It's because of inflation. And so just so a $1 currency would be worth a penny, let's say. So what the Congress did in the back room, as usual, said, we'll go buy all of this penny currency, and then Congress passed a law and redeemed it at 100%. So if you showed up with a handful of the inflated currency you'd paid a dime for, $10 worth, you got it for a dime. So you have $1,000 of this stuff, which maybe you paid some small amount for. Then you'd present, the congressman would collect this, and then they presented that $1,000 of paper for a government bond, which paid an interest rate and converted at 100%. So, our financial guys have been on top of us for so long. It's just a miracle we're still around. But so that's one of the first swindles, and that's Alexander Hamilton and his gang. And
and if I can jump in here for a second too, the way that the currency system works now, isn't it based on something that you constantly have to have debt, and it just reissues debt?
Yeah. Well, that's it. That's where Abraham Lincoln was our first big example of that, because during the Civil War, he went to New York because he needed money for the Civil War. And New York said, well, it's going to be 25% interest. He said, no, it's not going to pay interest. I'm not going to pay any interest. So he created the greenback, which he issued without debt. And he created the national banking system. And a very clever arrangement. And so he fought the Civil War, won the Civil War with the greenback. Of course, Wall Street's not particularly happy about that, but what could they do? So anyway, you know what happened with Lincoln. After the war is over, we've got the whole issue of Reconstruction of the South and expanding west for the American continent. And of course, with the greenback, you could have done that without any debt. You could have reconstructed the South, built half a dozen railroads to the west. But as it was, they did him in, so that didn't work. And it never surfaced again. And Grover Cleveland he could have continued the greenback, but he refused to do that. He went to Wall Street and borrowed money at interest to be paid in gold. So the greenback had a fairly short history, and that takes you through to the World War WW1.
Didn't Hitler kind of do the same thing back when he was starting to gain power in Germany? They were basically a bankrupt nation, and he said, "Look, we're gonna create a completely new financial system. We're not going to pay back monies to these offshore interests, and we're just going to create our own currency and back it with service, etc."
Yeah, well, he was a second run at the greenback type system. Again, you're tangling head on with British, and so he had a basic system, a basic political system of full employment, living wage, universal health care, education for anybody who was worth it, leisure for the working class, pensions, secure pensions, old age security, and affordable housing. He had the whole Megillah. So how could you be against him? And the people were not against him. They admired him and they supported him because he had their life in sight. And then he just reinvigorated industry by using national credit to finance the reconstruction of the nation and build the highways, and to build his first secret weapon, which was the people's car. Again, he tangles by using this interest-free financial process. He personally drew the lines for the Volkswagen, built a whole factory and a whole community to build a Volkswagen. And 1938 Party Congress, I think it was, they unveiled the first 7 Volkswagens. That's his secret weapon. And again, the Brits and the Americans went berserk. Because here you have this simple little car, it's air-cooled, easy to maintain, runs forever, drives well, and is not too expensive. I mean, there was a threat, because the British had the dominant place in car market at that time around the world. Because the British Empire, of course, you got British cars in every continent there is. And so they could see this Volkswagen as a doom for so much of their industry. Anyway, so they immediately mobilized for World War II. The British were drafting for war production in 1937, conscripting housewives into war production. And nobody else knew there was going to be a war. But so
that's a lot of stuff you don't hear about. I mean, you definitely hear the negatives and the bad things that happened out there in Germany. It's interesting, a lot of the stuff you brought up, I'll bet you 90% of the people that even do research into World War II and what it was like in other places in the world probably might not have that information. That's interesting.
Well, you have to piece it together, because I don't think you can write an historical book of WW2 that takes into account the technical realities and the social realities. Because the people of Germany were totally liberated by this guy. I mean, they had been in despair for, 1918 to 1928. How long is that? That's 10 years. 15 years, they'd been through the financial grinder. And just no hope. Hope was replaced with despair, particularly for a young person. Whereas one of the first things he did, the National Socialist Workers' Party did, was make it practical for a young couple to get married. Even if they didn't have much of a job or income, they had housing and a basic startup in survival facilities. So that was such an achievement, and it didn't cost very much. But the invention of the Autobahn and all that stuff, that was huge manual labor. And then The philosophy in Germany was, the political philosophy is that everybody had to work. And this is kind of unusual. And you would be graded in your community if you were work shy. You know, the old geezers on the porch would be watching. And if you weren't off to work early in the morning and you were just sort of laying about, you could be work shy. And then you would be taken off to the camp and trained on how to be a worker. So the first episode of the concentration, the labor camps, they're called concentration, the labor camps were to teach bums, a lot of guys, lounge lizards, how to be workers. And after 6 or 8 weeks, months in the labor camp, doing exercises and getting up at 5 in the morning and doing all this drill, it was certainly better to be out working than put up with this. So once you're released from the camp, you go and go to work. And of course, you got a regular paycheck once you went to work. But so the work shy attribute of the National Socialist period is kind of fun.
Can I jump in real quick and ask you just one question that's on my mind about that era?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. The Man in the High Castle, I'm sure you've read the book or heard of it, right? By Philip K. Dick? The alternative version of what would happen if the Germans actually won the war and took over.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I've heard of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I've seen all the episodes so far in the series that's came out, and it's pretty interesting. And one thing that I find kind of sad is one of the main guys one of the main characters is in the film is a real high up in the hierarchy of the German Reich, and his son has issue with, I don't know what's wrong with him, but basically the doctor says, you know, he's going to start crumbling and falling apart in the next few months. And so basically the doctor gives him a shot. There's this medicine or something that's essentially going to kill him. You know, it's designed to kill him because he's not in good health. So was that the way it was back then in Germany? I mean, if somebody was not considered healthy or they had some type of dis-ease or ailment, that instead of having to go through therapy or living it out, they would just take them out immediately?
Well, there was, there's always been, at that time in the 30s, even here in North America, was the idea of euthanasia for the incapable. In other words, because at that time, labor, your capacity for labor was largely a function of the agricultural economy. If you couldn't lift the bale and heave the hoe, you know, and harness the horse, you were a handicap, a real burden on the household. So the idea of euthanasia was a philosophical statement. Now in Germany, it was tried, but there was huge resistance to it, so it failed. But that's not to say that there wasn't an occasion where that happened. Now today, it's being repeated again here in North America with the study of the uterus. They study the child in the uterus. If it looks like it's going to be crippled, they'll suggest aborting it. And there is a fair bit of that, but then there's a fair objection to that too. So the same argument holds. But at that time, the Germans were just so outspoken in their creed, they allowed themselves to be manipulated by anybody that had an angle. And they weren't they weren't Bernays oriented yet. And that's, what is it, Edouard Bernays is the beginning of modern advertising.
Okay. I didn't mean to take us off track there. That was just one thing that popped in my mind. Now, you know, and also in your book, Money, the 12th and Final Religion, do you have some comparisons there that you make with Moloch?
Well, yeah, because it's an accident. Discovering the Moloch was an accident. I wrote the book, and I sort of stumbled on this, and I said, well, I'm not going to be a critic of religions, because people's religions matter, and they work for that person. And so I don't have an argument with religions, and I didn't want to discover another God. But anyway, the first reviewer of the book on Amazon wrote a terrific review. It's been done away with now. It's not there now. But he pointed out that I discovered two gods. And I'd been denying that for the whole period. And finally I said, I'll just fess up. I'll say, okay, there is another God. A parallel and simultaneous God that's parallel with the salvation God. In other words, the the sin, guilt, salvation dogma of Christianity has an alternative and simultaneous God, which is the Moloch, which is perpetual debt, money and interest, and stock exchanges. And so I'm forcing myself to accept that, and they run simultaneously, but one hides within the other one. The Moloch hides in plain sight, and whereas the church God, Christian God, can forgive, and he's always redeeming and coming back and rescuing his followers. The Moloch is quite different. There's no pardon and no forgiveness, ever. And but that's how money works. Money doesn't pardon and money doesn't forgive. And you have to have a belief system. Now, in the belief in any of the religions, they've got a certain set of beliefs which are genuine and essential to the believer. Where the Moloch is quite simple. You've got to believe one thing. You've got to believe that money, unlike anything else on the planet, can grow without air, earth, water, or sunlight. You take your $100 to the bank, they lock it in an airtight vault, and they say it's going to pay 6%. Come back a year later, you get $106. How'd that happen? That's too crazy for common sense. But that belief mechanism has taken over the mind like a psychic fire. It's been around for 2,000 years now. And I like to toy with the Bible stories and examine where it happened and how it happened. And so interest on money is like the fire in the burning bush. The burning bush burns, but it does not consume. Money creates interest, but it does not consume the money itself, the principle. So you've got the same psychological experience. And so that was my interpretation of Moses at the bush. He's discovering interest on money. And I've toyed with that a little bit, not too much. But the story of money is actually in the Bible, in Genesis 47, where I guess it's Joseph gets to work for the Pharaoh and gets to be a big deal. And he takes over the operating of and Akhenaten is the Pharaoh, and Akhenaten discovers Israel. Now, what he calls Israel is photosynthesis. Now, he didn't like the way his country was run with 3 different religions. The sun was a religion, and there was Isis, and then there was El. So there's 3 dominant religions, and they all have priesthoods that are taking up his time and his property and his money for his wealth. So he thought about it one day and looked at the sun and said, well, there's a power of the sun that supports all life. And the word he used, the phonetic he used to describe it was Israel. So the word Israel gets appropriated through different phases to be misunderstood as a place. And but anyway, while he's doing all that, Joseph, the executive, is doing razzle-dazzle in the empire, and the 7 lean years and the 7 fat years. And how does he do it? First, he goes to the people, and what did I have it somewhere in my. I have to read. I wrote it, but it's.
Oh, no problem.
If you read the story in Genesis 47, it explains exactly what happened. How there was the people are part of the Pharaoh's family. But Joseph goes in there and tells them, no, you don't need to do that. You got to borrow this money. And the way that it worked at the time is all property, all transactions were done goods for goods. In other words, I would bring you a pail of wheat, and you'd give me a liter of wine, or something like that. It was always good for goods, and it had to be authenticated at the temple. So in order for our deal to be binding, you would have to go to the temple, and the scribe would make a little notation on on a little clay tablet, about the size of the palm of your hand, I guess, and he would note that I gave you a bushel of wheat and you gave me a liter of wine. And so so it was legal, so it was binding. And that's how all trade was done. And if, for instance, if you had something that you wanted to get rid of and I wanted it, we would say, okay, but I don't have a liter of wine right now. I won't have any wine until August. So we'd go to the temple. You would give me whatever we were talking about, a puppy, let's say, or a chicken. And he would mark down, the priest would make a little clay tablet, one puppy in exchange for 1 liter of wine due in August. So then he'd take that tablet and put it ahead on the shelf to the month of August. So in August, he'd go look at those tablets and say, this turkey's got to come up with a liter of wine. So that's how all trade was done at that time. And at that time also, the temple had all sorts of different weights, little feldspar, little stone weights. And that's how they portioned out the seed for the farmers and for it to be paid. In other words, you worked in a field, you'd come in at the end of the day to get your handful of grain, which was your pay. And depending on your standing in the merit of the workers, it depends on how much grain you would be given. So they had to have a separate weight for each category of worker. Now visualize this as a young scribe trying to become a priest. You had to memorize all those things, and you had to know all the different categories of workers so that when they came in, you gave them the right amount of pay. It's just a marvelous system. But you can imagine how much work that would be for the young priest or young scribe. He wanted to grow up and be a priest someday. And so nobody's ever figured out really how that worked. But it's pretty obvious that it did work, and it worked well.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I mean, that's pretty fascinating if you think about it. That certainly would take a lot of work. Now that you've got computers and tracking systems, I think it could be easier to deal with that type of situation, but certainly I could see a lot being involved with that.
Yeah. Well, our buddy Joseph, he can do all that. He's really smart. And so he gets in there and he says, there were 7 good years and 7 bad years. And during the good years, Joseph collects all the surplus into inventory. And in the bad years, he sells the inventory back to the people, the same people who created it in the first place. Now the implication is that there was money involved at that time, that money had already been created, because they had to pay for the inventory they were getting. And this is the first experience of money transaction that we can interpret from Scripture. And it must have come as a real shock to the Egyptians, because prior to that time, when they were just members of the Pharaoh's household, you put it in inventory and then you get it back. Well, they put it in inventory, Joseph had acquired it, and now they wanted he wouldn't give it back to them unless they paid money for it. So they had to get money. And not only that, but Joseph was selling the surplus inventory to his family, which was coming from Palestine. And that must have created a certain tension. And not only that, his family had been in Egypt. He brought his family to Egypt to look after the Egyptians' cattle. So the only asset that the Egyptian people had left was their cattle under the supervision of Joseph's relatives. So what they do is that they have famine. They get a famine. So they have to eat the cattle. So you're running out. You got nothing. All you have left is your land. You're an Egyptian. All you have left is your land. You've used up everything else. And so they have to trade what's left of their cattle for bread to live. Well, they're at the end of the line. They've got nothing left. So what do they have to do? They have to get seed to plant to grow a crop to survive with. And so what he does was he takes all the last of their money. There's no more money left in the economy now because they had to buy the seed to plant to survive. So the Egyptians and money systems even today misunderstand what happened. They say the money system failed. No, the money system did not fail. It worked perfectly. It collected all the money in one place. And that's how money systems work. They just iterate until it all goes into one place. And then there's a crisis of some kind. But the upshot of it is that Joseph is now in charge. He owns it. Instead of the Pharaoh being the head guy, Joseph is the head guy. So he's introduced himself as a third party between the traditional monarch and the people. So he's introduced finance for the first time. And just like the central bank, now the Federal Reserve, is an intermediary between government and the people. So nothing's changed in 2,000 years. And the upshot of it is that the people, now what he does is, then he tells the people after they get the seed that their taxes are no longer 10%, they're 20%. So he doubles their taxes. So he gives himself 100% of the revenue that had previously gone to the Pharaoh. And the people are so happy, they say, Joseph, you saved our life. We volunteer to be your servant. That's what the scripture says. That's what the Bible says. I doubt if the people said that. And Joseph says, in acknowledgement, says, behold, I have bought you this day and your land. So the story of high finance is so beautifully encapsulated in this one chapter in the Bible that it's just astonishing. But the upshot of it is that the story moves into the Exodus and saga like that. But what happened was that Akhenaten had brought in the best minds from Damascus, the best schools in Damascus, best business schools, and they were called the Hebrew people, and he brought them in to teach his Egyptians, managers, how to do free trade, how to do international trade. And so we have a second introduction of superstition here, because free trade is a superstition. It doesn't really exist. And so he brings these people in. The Egyptians don't like them because they're intruders. They call them the intruder people. And the intruder people get dissatisfied with their position. And then they do the famous Exodus story where they borrow without any intent to repay all the gold and silver of the Egyptians, stash it on the kids, and leave town in the Exodus saga. And so that's the beginning of felony larceny. So we have a whole change of consciousness taking place here with the discovery of money. And Julian Jaynes tells us that thought did change about that time. Prior to that time, there was no such thing as consciousness. But along about the same time as the discovery of money, consciousness comes to our capacity, and what comes with it is deceit. So prior to that time, sometime probably 2,000 years ago, we didn't know deceit. We were just a humble little working little minions. But somehow, with the advent of consciousness, we learned how to be one thing on the inside and another thing on the outside. And so that's the beginning of money. And it happens quite by accident, in the sense that if you go to the temple, well, there's two stories to how it was begun, and one of them is kind of spooky. But the practical point is that when we were dealing at the temple, if you had something I needed and I couldn't pay you right away, the scribe would make a note on his clay tablet, and then we'd settle up later. Now, if I was a hustler, I could go around and I could meet all kinds of people, and they'd all owe me something. So the scribe would have 50 little tablets for August, let's say, that everybody owes me something in August. And one day I go to the port and there's a new ship just pulled in, or a camel caravan just came in. It's loaded with carpets, and I want to buy all these carpets. But that would take everything that I've got, all the assets I have on record. I'd have to collect them all and pay the carpet guy, right? So I go to the temple and I tell the scribe, make a summary of everything that is owed me for August, and I'll take that down and give it to the carpet guy, and I'll get the carpets. Well,
Okay.
So the scribe takes a look at these 50 little tablets and says, hey, it's late. I'm going off for the weekend. Forget this. I'm not going through this. And he takes a little dollop of silver and he whacks it with a temple seal and said, here, take this. Give this to the carpet guy and tell him about all this stuff you got here due in August. So I take the little dollop. It's a coin. And I take it to the carpet guy and I say, look, this is worth everything I got at the temple right at the moment. And he may double check that with the scribe. Let's say he does. And he's pleased. It's okay. So he takes the little dollop of coin and I get the carpets. So by accident, money was created because the scribe did not want to go back and recalculate all those 50 tablets. He's a lazy scribe. And so here I am with this dollop, and I give the silver to the rug merchant. He takes it, and he's pleased, and he takes it elsewhere. He may take it to somewhere else, and he explains the same deal. And pretty soon it's circulating at some agreed value in the market. And the priest and the scribe hear about this, and they watch this, and they say, wow, that's pretty easy. So they find out in a stroke of genius, it dawns on them, they don't have to do anything but make these little coins and give the coins out to anybody who is substantial enough in the community to be accepted as a competent trader. Now, you and I couldn't get it because we don't have a record as competent traders, but the competent trader would go to the temple and say, gee, I need one of those dollops because I want to buy some Greek wine coming in on the boat. Whack, and they give it to him. So the priests had become like gods because they could create out of nothing. I mean, sort of theoretically, there might have been a record of this stuff on the clay tablets, but if they didn't bother to look, who would know? Nobody could read. Only the priests could read, and the scribes, of course. So that is our first money, first coin, because the first coins didn't have value like we have a 20 or a 50 or a $100 bill. That coin had a very abstract value, and it circulated. And within the legend of the market, it took a value. It got a value. Now this is where it gets spooky. So that, now it's a fact, I had it written down, spooky. It's the fact that all early coins are also units of weight, and weight is derived from units of volume. These measures are exact products or ratios to the physical planet. Now, if that doesn't hit you between the eyes, the cubic measure used in antiquity was found to represent a round number of coins. In most cases, the weight of the coin divided neatly into the local unit of weight for the corresponding country and the time in history when the money was in use. In other words, it's saying that whoever created these first coins had perfect knowledge of the volume of the planet Earth. Now take that and put that in your pipe and smoke it.
I'm just trying to understand it first. That's incredible. I mean, this looks like they're using geometry and all sorts of different parameters, and they're creating, I mean, it sounds like a pretty unique form of currency.
Well, but what it's saying, I think what it's telling us, without saying so many words, is that there's an extra natural intervening power taking place then. And that intervening power had full knowledge of the weight and volume of the planet. And the silver and gold coins, which were not necessarily temple coins, But the silver and gold was a transaction between gods. That sounds really weird, but apparently, whoever it was that had the measure of the physical volume of the earth knew other beings that knew the physical volume, and they would exchange on that known bit of information. So there's two dimensions to the existence of the coinage. One is the spooky dimension, is how would they know that? And why would the coin weights for the Incas be identical to the coin weights of the Mediterranean basin, 5,000 years difference? So these things they're beyond chance, and which speaks to some other dimension. But it also still exists in people's fantasies about gold. People think that gold is going to save the money system. That's crazy. But anyway, that's common on the web these days.
That's pretty unique, and I've got to add to that also, if you're familiar with alchemy, like you're talking about creating something out of nothing or transforming energy somewhat, whether you're turning carbon into gold, etc. Money is just like that, especially this fiat currency. And now you're talking about the beginning of monies and possibly this godlike consciousness transferring through these people that were making these things, or maybe they were just really in tune in this mystery type information, this occult knowledge that's been passed on. Maybe it's just a part of certain mystery schools and those that have been chosen to pass that on from generation to generation. Maybe there's people that can still do that kind of stuff. What do you think?
Well, yeah, that's quite likely. That's probably as plausible as and would fit with the legend, because the legend of the Ebla, Petinato was an archaeologist, and he discovered Ebla, and the oldest known civilization and the oldest language. Ebla is in Syria, and the legend has it that the gods came down from the sky and built their own temple, and Moloch was the name of the god, and he organized commerce all through what is now Turkey and Iraq and Syria. All that area was under his jurisdiction as a great market. There was no government; it was just a market, and he administered the market. And his name Moloch mutates into Moloch later on, another 1,500 years later. But the fact is that if these entities they call them celestials, if the celestials do introduce levels of thought or genetic reasoning, then could be quite reasonable that the occult passed on for generations and generations would perpetuate this level of measurement that just happens to coincide thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. Yeah, that's true. But you're still stuck with the spooky part of it. There's that somebody had to do it first, and somebody had to know the weight and volume of the planet. So that's a story for somebody else.
That's incredible. It really is. I mean, that's some deep roots right there. Where do you think the future of money is going, Richard?
Well, we have to worry about another shift in consciousness. And every 2,000 years, our photosynthesis cycle completes itself. But money as it stands is credit in circulation. Credit is confidence in each other. It's a shared sort of spirit. And it's regulated by the priests, which in this case is the central bank. And at some point, now, if there is a shift in consciousness, what that would be, wow, that's really fascinating. Would that mean a complete breakdown in confidence or a rejection of confidence between people? A complete breakdown in credit? It's hard to imagine at this stage because credit is so dominant in all life forms now. Or would it just revert to a sort of high-tech version of the first temple, where each transaction had to be acknowledged by a scribe or a priest in some way? But I'm guessing I've got two minds in that. One is that it could be a synapse, a rejection of some kind, which takes you back to the Stone Age, because in it's purely a case of strength, might makes right. If somebody needs something, they're strong enough to get it, they get it. But that's kind of hard to accept. But on the other hand, it goes the other way and becomes more refined, and you become a part of the grand scheme of things with constant monitoring of your activity and what you can get and what you're entitled to have. There's probably more in that direction. I'm not sure if that's more desirable, but anyway,
Right.
That's probably what's going to happen.
Well, I mean, have you heard of the possibility of everything becoming just completely digital, where there is no paper trail anymore? It's all just done via electronically, whether you have a microchip or you use some other type of medium for a transfer of exchange?
Yeah, this is that seems to be very popular, but
Are you-
it's all dependent on so-called B plus from electrical point of view. You got to have a basic battery power for it to take place, and that's kind of risky.
Yeah, that's true. Are you a religious person, Richard?
Not really. No, I didn't know there was a religion until I was 7 years old.
Okay. So when you read the Bible and take this information and write about it, it's more of a history aspect, not a faith type.
No, there's no violation of infant education, infant conditioning. I don't have those first 7 years of conditioning, so I approach this as, isn't this fascinating, And I read something like I read Joseph. Now, I've heard preachers preach this stuff, and they get it wrong. They would never take my point. And I hear scores of stories about the Exodus, and nobody mentions it as felony larceny. Well, to me, that's obviously what it is. And a few other things like that. And Moses at the burning bush. They mystify this stuff when, as a practical matter, it's a story. And it's telling a good story, but often the story is not very complimentary. And in fact, if you read the stories carefully, you find two gods. It's quite obvious that the God of the Exodus there's two of them there. One of them is your salvific God, and the other one's your larceny God. And then you go, where else do you go? You go somewhere else, and it's the food. The most terrible story in the book is about the God tells the people, if you find carry and you find something dead, give it to somebody else. Give it to a stranger or sell it to somebody. Wait a minute. What kind of a God is going to do that? Sell foul foodstuffs to a neighbor. So that's a separate God. Your salvation God wouldn't do that, I don't think. So if you just go through the book, it's full of good stuff like that, if you give it the option to have two stories. And the second story is probably just as informative as the first. But anyway,
Absolutely.
The point of the Moloch is that he hides in plain sight because he's a devious God, and he can't forgive and he can't forget. And often a lot of the saga in Christianity about the Antichrist and the devil and all that, they divert away from the possibility of a real parallel simultaneous God. So in the human condition, in the psyche, I'm not, I don't know if they come around and show up from spaceships or whatever, but anyway, in the psyche, in the intellect, it's just as genuine. In fact, it's more universal. Money is the more universal religion than any of the others, because all the other ones are in dispute with each other. But money religion is universal.
I've never heard it worded that way before, but I think that's a very eloquent way to put it.
Well, if it's forced on me, I didn't mean to go there. I just took off on my Nixon saga, and that's where it went.
Well, it's very interesting, and I certainly appreciate you coming on the show with us, Richard, and expressing this information. Now, For those that have an opportunity to listen to this podcast, I would strongly recommend you check out Richard's website, rdwainewilling.com. That's spelled R-D-U-A-N-E, willing.com. You can actually pick up either Money, the 12th and Final Religion, or The American Caliphate. Now, are these also available on Amazon?
One of them, the Money, is available on Amazon. The other one is PDF. You can get both of them for $10 on PDF from my website. And they're both available from me, from the order page. And a couple of small bookstores are carrying. You might ask your bookstore. And they're available from Barnes Review, I think, also.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you, I mean, you've really put things together in very practical manners, and I appreciate the approach. Also, just being very well balanced. I like that. And also, you've got a bunch of podcasts. I know you put together a new podcast quite frequently, so I would recommend also folks to check out the website for some of his recent shows and upcoming opportunities. Now, do you have anything else that you're writing or something soon that will be coming out and released that we might have an opportunity to know about right here?
Well, I've got myself in a real funk this time. I can't leave well enough alone with money. I wandered off into behavior modification, and that is such a spacey area that I should have something in another 6 months or so, but that is so far out. That may answer my question about what the next synapse is going to be, because they've got technology so far advanced, they can manage your thoughts, and they've got, the brain only operates at like 5,000 megabits or something, where the supercomputer operates at 5 million megabits. So the supercomputer can, with a little patience, map your brain. And not only that, but it can intercept thought in your brain before you know about it. And it's just so weird. But if this gets out of control, or if this runs amok, there's our 2,000-year synapse. And it's really spacey, because there wouldn't be any more one thing on the outside and one thing on the inside, because all thought would be known. You couldn't have a private thought. If you see somebody and say, "Wow, that looks pretty good to me," she'd know about it right away. So if that's the next synapse in the human condition, we're really in for it. That's all I can say. But anyway, I'm supposed to be writing something in that area, and it's a train wreck, but I'll keep going.
Oh, I certainly can't wait to read more about that. I mean, I've done research into these mind control techniques that have been being perfected for decades. You go all the way back to the 30s when Tavistock and other organizations were working on ways to brainwash the masses with music and all sorts of cool stuff. You know, I mean, it's just really strange the times that we live in. So I appreciate you coming on the show with us. And folks, once again, check out rdwainewilling.com. Be safe and be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Good night. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Richard Dwayne Willing. Now, he is an author of two fantastic books you can pick up on his website, rdwainewilling.com. The first one, Money, the 12th and Final Religion. The next one is The American Caliphate. Now, these are two very thought-provoking books, and if you're ready to have some paradigms altered, I would recommend reading these. So just an enormous amount of information and pretty easy to read as well. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us tonight here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Fine, excellent. Looking forward.
Absolutely. It's great to have you on the show. We've had several requests to get you on here, and I was hoping we could really discuss both of these books in pretty good detail with the time that we have together. But first, I'd like to get into who you are as a person. If you could give our audience a brief description about yourself and what brought you down the path to write these types of books.
Well, I was motivated by a political disaster that I was witness to, the so-called Watergate saga of President Nixon. I had a function at the Federal Home Loan Bank Board at the time, Nixon was going to convert all the savings and loans into commercial banks. Now that's a revolutionary move for anybody familiar with banking, because the savings and loans are just loan institutions and savings. They could not create money, where a regular bank creates money. And Nixon was going to sideswipe the Federal Reserve by creating a parallel system. And my job was to go out and make sure all the savings and loans were on the same protocol so we could put them on a computer, a central computer across from the White House. And this was all underway and moving along. And if I'd been successful, that enterprise, we would have a parallel banking system now. The Federal Reserve may be under serious, would have been under serious competition. But
what would that have done, though? I mean, would that have caused more of a fruitful economy?
I think so, because your savings and loans were centered in small-town America, and the local doctor and farm implement and big farmers and car dealers and your druggists and your construction guys were all members of the savings and loan on the board. So it was a very local economic interest. So had they been able to be commercial banks where they could control their fortune directly instead of having to go through the Federal Reserve System, I think it would have been better for the economy in general, and you would never have had that interest rate crisis of the Carter period, because there's no need for that. But the purpose of those high interest rates during Carter was to destroy the savings and loans. Very clever process. Wall Street's just too smart for us. That's all there is to it. They wanted to get the money out of the savings and loans away from local people, so they created money market funds. And these, you could get a money market fund by a certificate of deposit. And the reason you do that was because it paid a higher interest rate. And by one more point of interest, people were taking their money out of the savings and loan and putting it in the money market fund certificate of deposit. And so Wall Street bled the money out of the savings and loans. And then the savings loans were desperate for money because people wanted mortgages and they had obligations and so forth. So what happened was Wall Street comes back to the savings and loans with the same money that they've taken out. They come back with what they call jumbo deposits, whereas they would bring a $100,000 deposit to the savings and loan and get a certificate of deposit. And it would pay 5 or 6%, which was a pretty good rate back in that time. And so the savings and loan was just glad to have the money, so they paid the extra interest to get their own money back. Very clever. And the upshot of it was that they kept escalating the interest rates and pumping the money out of the savings and loans until finally the savings loans, the real estate business, the real estate industry just dried up because mortgages were too expensive. So the savings and loans couldn't meet their obligations and they were bankrupted. Very clever process. And the trick of it was, with a certificate of deposit, it was a federal guaranteed document. So Wall Street could take that document for a $100,000 deposit and trade it on the commercial markets. And this is all kind of convoluted, but that's the way Wall Street rips off your money, and they did it again, a version of it, with the mortgage swindle.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so the same protocol works every time. But anyway, while I was at the bank board, Federal Home Loan Bank Board, I had the assignment to make sure the savings and loans could become banks. And I went about my task, and some months after I'd gotten the assignment, I was called into the office and they said, we're going to do some changes around here. And I said, well, what about our project? And they said, what project? And they denied that they'd ever had that project underway in the first place, of converting the S&Ls. And I thought, wow, this is really exciting. I'm in the twilight zone here. But I knew something at very high levels was going on, because a lot of whispering and a lot of transfers and a lot of shuffling around at the head office personnel. And one thing led to another, and it became obvious that Nixon was just under tremendous pressure. And so he canceled his project, of course. And one thing led to another, and they finally got rid of him. But the key player, was a guy named Preston Martin. Now, he'd been the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which was the savings and loan head office. And apparently, he decided that he'd rather have a position at the Federal Reserve than be head of the savings and loan conversion. So it looks like he double-crossed Nixon. And I'm offering him up as the classic deep throat, which supposedly talked to those two reporters in the Washington Post, because they were supposed to be meeting people in garages and alleys and all that. But I'm sure they were sitting with Preston Martin in the best restaurants in Washington, getting debriefed on how the system was coming down. And so I don't have a lot of faith in the Washington Post. But the upshot of it is, of course, that Nixon got resigned. He was purged, actually. And my task of converting the SNLs went up in smoke, and I saw the power of money dismantle the presidency. And I thought, wow, that's really impressive, because I always thought the president was numero uno. Little did I know that he's a pretty low on the totem pole. And so one thing led to another, and I left Washington and migrated to Canada. But
you know, if I can jump in real quick, you don't hear a lot about Nixon except for Watergate. That's typically the overall archetype of, if somebody thinks of Nixon, first thing, oh, it's Watergate. You don't hear much about this. And I often wonder who actually owns the Federal Reserve anyway, because isn't the Federal Reserve compiled by a bunch of offshore interests, basically?
That's the legend, but theoretically it's owned by its member banks. The Federal Reserve was set up as, if you were a major bank in the United States at that time, prior to the Fed, you could issue your own money, your own currency. National Bank had their money, Chase had their money, and the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, could issue Treasury bills, Treasury notes. So everybody had a kind of a piece of the pie. But when the Federal Reserve was instituted, all these bankers got together and said, we'll gang up on the economy. And the way they did it was becoming so-called owners of the Federal Reserve. So they formed into 12 regions in the U.S., and each of the regions owned so much of the Federal Reserve. So it's technically nationally owned, but owned by national interests. But the Chase and the National and manufacturers and all those great banks, Wells Fargo, they have huge stockholders from foreign interests. I mean, you could be a lot of British, a lot of Swiss banks own stock in American banks.